In the spring of 2009, a land broker named Chet Voss drove his white Chevy Silverado down a two-track gravel road in Pawnee County, Nebraska, and made an offer that, by his own later admission, he expected her to accept before he finished the sentence. He had sold 11 properties in the county in the previous 3 years, and he had a sense for the ones that were ready to move. A 73-year-old widow on 700 acres with aging infrastructure and no heirs in the county. Sitting on ground he valued at $1.4 million based on comparable sales and his own estimate of what the place could produce under proper management. Seemed about as ready to move as anything he had worked. He wore clean boots and had brought 2 copies of the purchase agreement, pre-filled except for the price line. He had rehearsed the conversation during the drive from Tecumseh, running through the burden of maintenance, estate planning, peace of mind. He had never driven this particular two-track before, but the ground on either side of it looked to him, through the windshield, like ground that was not doing what it could be doing. The county assessor had the 700 acres valued at just under $2.1 million. Voss's offer was $1.4 million. He called it fair, given the ground's condition. He brought a pen. Myrtle Hawk handed the pen back. She said it was a nice pen. That was about all she said. Voss drove back to Tecumseh and wrote in his call log that the owner was emotionally attached and would likely reconsider. He noted the understocking. He noted the fence condition. He did not note the soil organic matter. He had not tested for it. By the time the 4th offer came in the autumn of 2017, it did not arrive in a white pickup. It arrived in an envelope, handwritten, from the man who had worked her cattle and her pastures for 11 years. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he was 44 years old, and he had $112,000 saved from 11 years of careful living on a foreman's wages and his own small cow-calf operation. The farm was still not for sale. What Myrtle Hawk offered instead was something no land broker had thought to ask for, and what it produced, in the years that followed, could not have been built from a purchase at any price. Let me tell you what the ground looked like in 2009, because what you saw depended entirely on what you knew how to see. Myrtle had grown up on the eastern edge of that farm, the daughter of a man named August Hoch, who had bought the original 480 acres in 1948 with cash saved from 12 years of custom combining across 4 counties. He had spent those 12 years watching other men's ground, doing it for hire with his own equipment. He had noticed which pastures looked like grass in August when everything else looked like dust. He had noticed that the men who ran cattle the way his grandfather had run them, moving constantly and resting the ground behind them, had a different kind of soil than the men who set stocking rates by the county average and left their animals in the same paddock through the whole season. August bought the 480 acres at age 37 and added the western 220 acres, the native prairie section, in 1961, when the widow who owned it passed, and her son in Omaha sold it to the first offer. He paid $28 an acre for the native ground, which the son considered generous. August considered it the best purchase he ever made. He was known for 2 things: his silence at the grain elevator and his grass. He grazed cattle the way his own father had shown him, moving them in dense herds across small sections of pasture, never leaving them long enough to graze a blade of grass below 4 inches, always resting the ground long enough for the root system to rebuild before the animals came back. He moved the temporary electric fence himself every 2 to 3 days, 1 paddock at a time across the rotation. He called it giving the land its breath. Extension agents in the 1960s called it inefficient. Harold Fry was 31 years old when he visited in 1967, 2 years out of his master's program at Lincoln. He drove a green university pickup, carried a clipboard with a forage assessment form, and walked the paddocks with August for an hour. He told August the ground could carry 40% more animals. He said moving cattle so frequently introduced inefficiency that would cost the operation meaningful income. He was sincere. He was not wrong about the labor hours. He was wrong about everything else. He wrote in his field notes that the Hawk operation showed no appreciation for modern stocking rates and appeared to be running on sentiment rather than science. The dismissal had a long life. Myrtle knew the note existed because August had requested a copy from the extension office and had tucked it inside the back cover of the water-stained ledger notebook where he recorded pasture rotation dates, rainfall measurements, and the height of the grass in each paddock going back to 1951. She had read it as a girl, maybe 12 years old, standing at the kitchen table while August was in the barn. She asked him later what sentiment meant. He set down the wrench he was cleaning and thought about it. He said he reckoned it meant something you could not put a number to, something a man with a clipboard didn't have a column for. Then he went back to moving the fence. After August died in the fall of 1989, Myrtle and her husband Garland ran the ground the same way. They did not modernize. They did not install a center pivot irrigation system when the county got its first ones in the late 1980s. They did not subscribe to a soil sampling service or hire an agronomist or attend the production agriculture seminars at the Pawnee City Extension Office that Bud Kemple, who farmed the ground to the east, attended every year and took notes at. What they did was watch. Myrtle walked the pastures every morning before breakfast, reading the grass the way her father had taught her, pressing her boot heel into the sward to test the root mat, moving cattle when the forage height dropped to 5 inches, and resting the section until it came back past 8. In a dry year, the rest period ran to 60 days. In a wet one, 40 was enough. She trusted the ledger. She trusted the grass more. Garland kept the accounting, a quieter man even than August, a Bohemian Swede from Colfax County who maintained the columns with a precision August had never quite achieved. Revenue per head, operating cost per acre. The ledger grew a second notebook, then a third, filed in order on the shelf above the kitchen table Garland had built from an elm that came down in a storm in 1974. When Garland died in the winter of 2005, he left the farm in better shape than he had found it in 1963 when he and Myrtle were married. The soil organic matter on the native sections had been tested once, in 1998, when a graduate student from Lincoln had come asking questions for a dissertation on perennial grassland restoration. The results had gone into a footnote in a thesis that nobody read. The numbers were 5.1 to 5.8% by weight. The county average for comparable era crop ground in Pawnee County was 2.4%. Garland had noted the comparison in the ledger with his small, precise handwriting, and had not commented further. When Garland died, Myrtle kept the ledger herself. The entries are in her handwriting now, the same water-stained first notebook, the pages getting thicker near the spine where decades of notations had accumulated in layers, August's pencil under Garland's ballpoint under Myrtle's narrower hand. She did not change the column headings. She did not change the rotation calendar. She walked the same paddocks in the same order every morning, and wrote down the same measurements in the same columns, and moved the cattle when the grass told her to. By 2009, when Chet Voss arrived with his pen, the 700 acres contained 220 acres of native mixed grass prairie that had never been tilled, 180 acres of improved pasture rotated under August's system since 1951, and 300 acres of crop ground that Myrtle rented to her neighbor Bud Kemple for soybeans and winter wheat at $140 an acre. The soil organic matter on the native prairie sections still ran between 5.1 and 5.8%. Voss's appraisal had not tested for organic matter. He had looked at the fence lines, the age of the stock tanks, the distance from the county road, and the comparable sales in the county land records, and he had arrived at $1.4 million. He considered this generous for ground he assessed as underperforming. Myrtle thanked him for coming and walked him back to his truck. The second offer came in 2012 from a grain operation out of Hastings that was assembling a block of ground for row crop expansion. They had bought 3 adjacent parcels in the previous 18 months, and Myrtle's 700 acres sat in the middle of what they wanted. They offered $1.7 million. Their plan was to break the native pastures, pull the remaining fence lines, level the ground where it needed it, drill 2 center pivot systems from the aquifer, and plant the whole 700 acres in corn at a management density their agronomists calculated would yield 180 bushels per acre in average rainfall years. Their agronomist was a man named Stacy Erb, 38 years old, credentials from Kansas State, field tested on 12 operations across central Nebraska. He carried a tablet with a soil productivity mapping application that generated projections in color. He walked the paddocks with Myrtle for 2 hours, which was longer than he had planned, and was not uninterested. He said the grass was healthy, but the species composition was old-fashioned. He said a modern, improved fescue mix would give her more consistent production per acre. He said the native grass sections were underperforming relative to their potential under modern inputs. He said a woman in her situation ought to consider the liquidity. Myrtle said she would think on it. She did not think long. She had walked those same native sections that same morning, before Herb arrived, and had found what she found most springs. The first big blue stem was reaching past her knee in the low spots, the side oats grama coming back at the south end where the cattle had grazed it, hardest in February. The buffalo grass stitching itself thick across the bare spots near the stock tank the way it had done every year since before August bought the ground. She had crouched and pressed her thumb into the soil and felt the moisture that was still there from the snowmelt, held in the organic matrix the way a sponge holds water, available to the root systems through May and into June, while the neighbors' fields would be dry enough to need the pivot running. She knew what she was pressing her thumb into. It was not grass. It was 60 years of root death and regeneration, 60 years of dung and trampling and regrowth cycling, organic material back into the soil profile, 60 years of mycorrhizal networks threading through the subsoil and moving phosphorus between plant species, 60 years of earthworm populations building the tilth that no moldboard plow could replicate once it was gone. You could not buy what was in that soil. You could only inherit it, or build it slowly, or destroy it in a single plowing season. She told the Hastings operation no. Stacy Erb sent a follow-up letter 2 weeks later that restated the offer and noted gently that the native sections were classified as a non-commercial forage asset and would likely decrease in relative value as row crop ground in the region continued to appreciate. He was sincere. He was measuring the right things for the world he knew. He was not measuring the right things for what was coming. The third offer, in the spring of 2015, came from a conservation land trust out of Lincoln. They wanted to place a permanent easement on the native prairie sections, restricting future tillage and development, and purchase the 300 crop ground acres at full market rate. The total package was $1.9 million, structured in 2 parts, with a charitable deduction attached to the easement valuation that Myrtle's attorney in Tecumseh said was meaningful. Their representative was a young woman named Jana Correll, about 30 years old, patient and clearly careful, who spent a full afternoon walking the pastures with Myrtle and asking questions that Myrtle had not been asked before. She asked about the rotation intervals. She asked about which species had increased since the 1950s. She asked about what the native sections had looked like during the drought of 1988. Myrtle liked her. She answered all the questions. Then she turned the offer down. Jana Coral stood at her car for a moment before she got in. She was not offended. She was curious. She said she had evaluated a lot of properties, and most of the owners who turned down conservation easements were worried about control or didn't trust the structure or had family disagreements. She said she couldn't figure out what Myrtle was holding out for. Myrtle said she was not holding out for anything. She was waiting for the right question. Jana Correll looked at her for a moment. Then she got in her car and drove toward the county road, and the dust settled behind her, and Myrtle went back inside to update the ledger. Dale Pruitt had started as a part-time hand in 2006, the year after Garland died. Myrtle's nephew, a man in his 40s who worked in insurance in Beatrice, had driven up one weekend intending to help and had stayed 2 days before driving back, and Myrtle had not asked him to come again. She was not the kind of woman who asked for help twice from someone who had already shown her what his help looked like. Dale was different. He lived 6 miles east on a rented quarter section where he ran his own small cow-calf operation, 47 head, on leased pasture from a retired schoolteacher in Falls City. He carried debt the way men who are careful with money carry it, not comfortably but manageably, watching it the way a man watches the fuel gauge on a long drive. He had grown up in Thomas County in the Nebraska Sandhills, the grandson of a dryland wheat farmer named Otto Pruitt, who had farmed the same 320 acres for 40 years without irrigation and without much debt. And Dale had absorbed from that upbringing a patience with machinery and animals that did not come from books. He had heard about Myrtle's operation from a man at the sale barn in Pawnee City who said she was particular about her cattle and her grass, and that the two things were connected in some way the man couldn't quite explain. Dale drove by twice before he knocked on the door. He wanted to look at the fence lines and the cattle first. He came on a Tuesday morning in April 2006. Myrtle was moving a temporary electric fence panel in the south paddock when he pulled in. He got out of his truck and walked out to her without waiting at the gate, and picked up the other end of the panel without being asked. He started helping on days her knees gave her trouble. Within a year, he was coming 3 mornings a week. Within 3 years, he was managing the full rotation schedule, carrying the ledger in his truck, recording paddock dates and forage heights the way Garland had recorded them, in the same column headings August had set down in 1951. He had questions, not the kind Chet Voss or Stacey Erb had, which were really statements dressed in the syntax of questions, designed to lead a person from one conclusion to another the speaker had already decided on. Dale's questions were about mechanisms. He asked why August rested the paddocks for 45 days in June rather than 30. He asked what the difference was between the plants that came back first on a well-rested section and the plants that came back first on one that had been grazed shorts. He asked why Myrtle walked the south pasture before the north one, always, without exception, every morning. Myrtle started answering. There was a dog with her on most mornings, a black and white heeler named Rack, 9 years old, who had belonged to Garland and had appointed himself Myrtle's shadow after the funeral. Rack worked the cattle with the absorbed concentration of a dog who has done the same job long enough to have opinions about it And he had learned Myrtle's rotation calendar, the way working dogs learn anything, through repetition and consequence. And he would stand at the gate of the next paddock in the rotation and look back at her before she had finished reading the grass. He knew the order. He had known it longer than Dale had. Myrtle started answering Dale's questions the way August had answered hers. Directly, with mechanisms, without softening. Let me tell you what she taught him, because this is the part that most people miss when they look at a piece of ground and see only the fence lines and the head count and what the grass is doing above the soil surface. The grazing system August had built was not, at its root, about grass. It was about soil biology. Most grazing management in the 1960s treated pasture the way row crop agriculture treated a field, as a static resource to be extracted from at whatever rate was economically optimal, replenished by inputs when the extraction declined. Harold Fry's advice was built on that model. It was wrong not because the math was bad, but because the model was incomplete. Perennial prairie grasses grow in two directions at once. Above the soil, the blade captures sunlight and builds carbohydrate. Below it, the root system extends downward, in species like big bluestem sometimes to depths of 8 or 10 feet, storing energy reserves that the plant draws on to regrow after grazing. Graze a plant short repeatedly across a season, and the root system shortens to compensate, season after season, until the roots are shallow, the plant is weak, and the topsoil it was holding begins to move in the first hard rain. August had seen this happen on neighboring properties. He had seen it happen, to a lesser degree, on his own ground in the years before his father taught him the rotation. The lesson was simple in its logic and difficult in its discipline. Let the grass grow back completely before you graze it again. Do not graze it short. Move the animals before they overgraze and rest the section long enough for the roots to recover their depth. This is what the bison herds had done naturally, moving across the plains in concentrated masses, grazing intensely and briefly, and then moving on, resting each patch of ground for months before they returned. August was not mimicking a philosophy. He was mimicking a physical process. What the rotation built over decades was a soil ecosystem that functioned on a completely different energy budget than conventionally managed pasture. The native mixed grass sections on the Hoch farm stored carbon at a rate that modern cover crop programs, developed 40 years later, were only beginning to approximate in controlled trials. Each percentage point of organic matter in the soil holds roughly 27,000 gallons of water per acre. The native sections, running at 5.1 to 5.8%, were holding between 137,700 and 156,600 gallons of water per acre in the soil profile at any given time. County crop ground, running at 2.4% organic matter, was holding 64,800 gallons per acre. In a dry year, when no rain was coming to refill the deficit, that gap was not theoretical. That gap was the difference between grass that held green in August and ground that burned tan in June. It could not be purchased. It could not be manufactured. It had to be earned, slowly, by the same process that had built it in the first place, and it could be destroyed in a single tillage season and not rebuilt in anything less than a generation. August had not discovered any of this from a textbook. He had observed it. In the dry summer of 1955, the sections he had grazed hard in late May failed first when the rain stopped, while the sections rested until late July held green, when everything around them had turned tan and cracking. He wrote it in the ledger. He adjusted his rest intervals. He did it again the next year, and the year after, for 34 more years, adjusting, recording, adjusting again. The ledger was not a journal of what had happened. It was a map of what worked. Myrtle taught Dale the map. She taught him to read soil moisture by pressing his boot heel through the thatch and feeling the resistance, to identify the difference between a paddock ready to graze and one ready to rest by the way the seed heads were holding. She taught him why the south section dried earlier and needed longer rest in dry years, and why August's rotation calendar was not a rigid schedule, but a flexible one, timed to the plants rather than the date, and why that difference mattered more in a difficult year than in an easy one. Dale listened the way a man listens when he understands that the information has been earned over decades by a person he respects, and that no amount of asking will transfer it faster than the rate it can be absorbed. He asked one question at a time. He took his own notes in a separate notebook and compared them to the ledger entries each evening. By 2016, Dale had been carrying the ledger for 10 years. He had managed the rotation through 2 dry summers, one early frost that pinched the fall grazing window, and a wet spring in 2013 that had kept the north paddocks too soft to graze until mid-June. He had made adjustments to the rotation calendar that August had never had to make, because the seasons were running different than they had in the 1950s. And he had recorded his reasoning in the same columns, in the same shorthand notation, so that whoever read the ledger next would know not just what he had done, but why. Myrtle reviewed every entry on Sunday mornings. When she disagreed with a decision, she said so in one sentence. Twice, Dale had changed his approach mid-rotation after those conversations. Both times, the result was better than what he had planned. In the spring of 2016, the farm that surrounded Myrtle's 700 acres on 3 sides changed hands. Bud Kemple was 69 years old, and his knees had given out, and his son had moved to Colorado and had no interest in coming back to run row crops in Pawnee County. He sold his 1,200 acres to a corporate grain operation headquartered in Des Moines that had been assembling irrigated ground in eastern Nebraska and western Kansas for 3 years. The purchase price was $3.2 million, or about $2,667 per acre. The operation signed a 5-year surface lease on Myrtle's 300 crop ground acres at $100 to $65 per acre per year, which was $25 more than Bud had been paying, and installed 2 center pivot irrigation systems on the Kemple ground before spring planting. They also placed their agronomist on a quarterly visit schedule. Travis Dahl was 36 years old, a Ph.D. from Iowa State, with 6 years of field experience managing precision agriculture programs across the Central Plains. He drove a company SUV and carried 2 tablets, one for soil data and one for crop modeling, and he had a direct, confident manner that came from having been right most of the time in most of the situations he had worked. He was not a bad agronomist. He was a very good one, operating within a framework that had given him excellent results on irrigated row crop ground and had not yet been tested against anything significantly outside of that framework. He visited Myrtle's fence line in the fall of 2016 after the corn harvest on the Kemple ground had wrapped, and he was doing his year-end assessment. He stood at the fence for perhaps 15 minutes, looking at the native pasture sections. He had his soil data tablet, but he was not consulting it. He was looking at the grass, which at that point in October was going dormant, tan and dry-stemmed, the way native mixed grass prairie looks every fall. It does not look in October like what it is. It looks like tired old pasture. That is the appearance versus reality problem, and it is a problem that costs people information every time. He told Myrtle that her native pasture sections were carrying a forage deficit of roughly 30% compared to improved fescue ground at similar stocking rates, based on the seasonal production estimates in the literature for this latitude and soil type. He said it was a shame, given how nice the ground was. He said if she ever wanted to talk about a conversion program, he would be glad to model it for her. Myrtle said she had heard something like that before. Dale was leaning against the fence post 20 feet away, holding the ledger, listening. He had said nothing since Travis Dahl arrived. Travis Dahl did not look at him. He thanked Myrtle for her time and drove back toward the county road, and the dust from his SUV disappeared around the windbreak, and Dale walked over to where Myrtle was standing. She looked at the ledger in his hands. She said, "You write it down." He said, "Fall 2016, agronomist from the Iowa operation. Forage deficit assessment, 30% below improved fescue benchmark." She said, "Good, keep it." If someone searched the term forage deficit in the ledger, they would find it exactly once in that entry. They would also find, in the entries for the following summer, the data that answered it. The summer of 2017 was the driest Pawnee County had recorded since 1988. The county rain gauge at Pawnee City registered 6.2 inches from May through August, against a long-term average of 14.4 inches. The deficit was not a surprise exactly. The spring had been warm and dry, and the creek behind the county road had run low since April. And Dale had been watching the soil moisture readings in the ledger and had moved the cattle to the north paddocks by June 14th, 3 weeks earlier than the standard rotation called for, resting the south sections entirely to let the root systems hold their depth going into the dry stretch. The center pivot systems on the Iowa operation ran from June 22nd onward without a rest day. The monitoring wells on the Kemple parcels showed the aquifer dropping, 6 feet by mid-July, 9 feet by early August, 11 feet by the time the soybeans hit their peak water demand in late August. The corn held. The soybeans did not. They began showing stress in the second week of August, the uniform rows yellowing at the tips and midrib, in a pattern Travis Dahl attributed first to iron chlorosis and then to potassium deficiency. He adjusted the input program both times. The yellowing continued. The uniform crop had been planted wall to wall, the same variety across every acre, the same inputs, the same planting date. In a normal year, that uniformity was efficiency. In a drought year, it was fragility. Every plant experiencing the same stress at the same time, with no variation in the canopy to buffer it. The organic matter on the Iowa operations crop ground had been 2.7% in 2012 and was 1.9% in the summer of 2017. That 30% decline in 5 years was the real story. The soil was producing on credit. The credit was running out. What Travis Dahl had not factored into his August assessment was the trajectory. Trend lines in soil biology do not reverse easily. They respond to decades of change practice, or they do not respond at all. Across the fence, the native pastures were carrying the dry summer the way August had designed them to carry it. The big blue-stem root systems ran to 9 feet. The soil water holding capacity in the native sections, built over 66 years of organic matter accumulation, was drawing on reserves that the center pivot system next door was trying to replicate from a well. The biological infrastructure was intact. The mycorrhizal networks were still moving phosphorus between species. The tilth was still there. Dale had reduced the stocking density in late July, pulling 8 animals off the rotation and trucking them to his leased pasture in Falls City to reduce demand on the home ground. He noted the reason in the ledger: drought adjustment. reduced stocking by 8 head, July 29th. The decision cost some revenue. It preserved the grass. On August 14th, Dale walked the south paddocks with the ledger. The big blue stem in the low spots stood at 8 inches. The side oats grama on the south-facing slope stood at 5.5 inches. The ground felt firm, but not cracking. 6 inches of forage in the county's worst drought in 29 years. That was when Travis Dahl drove back out. He had been by the fence line 3 times since June, each time to check on the soybean stress response, and each time he had passed Myrtle's gate without stopping. On August 17th, he stopped. He did not have an appointment. He parked at Myrtle's gate and stood there for a moment looking at the grass on her side of the fence, and then at the stressed soybean rows on his side, and then he climbed between the wires and walked into the south paddock. He was not doing anything aggressive. He was trying to understand something. Dale saw him from the far end of the paddock and walked over. Travis Dahl was crouching down, pressing his fingers into the soil surface near the base of a big blue stem clump. He looked up when Dale arrived. He asked how the stocking rate worked. He meant it genuinely. Dale explained the rotation calendar, the paddocks, the rest intervals, the decision-making process that used forage height and root recovery rather than a fixed number of days. Travis Dahl listened without interrupting, which was not how he had listened the previous fall. He asked about the organic matter numbers. Dale showed him the most recent soil test in the ledger, done by the same certified lab in Lincoln that had run the 1998 test for the graduate student's dissertation. The native sections were at 5.4%. The improved pasture sections were at 4.1%. Both numbers had been moving upward since the first recorded test. Travis Dahl looked at the trend line. He said, "That's the opposite of what I'm seeing on the row crop ground." Dale said he knew. Travis Dahl looked at the grass for a while longer. He walked to the line between the rested south section and the previously grazed section to the east of it, where the cattle had been in late May, and he pressed his boot heel into the soil in both places and felt the difference. The rested section gave slightly under his heel. The grazed-out section was firm and dry. He said, "I called this ground a forage deficit operation last fall." Dale said, "I know." Travis Dahl said he might have been measuring the wrong thing. It was the most precise statement of the entire disagreement that anyone had managed in 8 years of offers and assessments and quarterly visits. Dale wrote it in the ledger that evening. August 17th, 2017. Travis Dahl, Iowa Operation Agronomist. Revised assessment. May have been measuring the wrong thing. He showed it to Myrtle at breakfast the next morning. She read it and handed the ledger back. She said, "August would have put it plainer than that. But it'll do." This is the place in the story where the number matters, so let me say it plainly. Word of what the native sections had done in August 2017 moved through the county's agricultural network the way useful information moves in a small rural community, quietly and quickly, until it reached someone who knew what it meant. Carla Weiss was 41 years old, a livestock nutritionist based in Fort Collins who consulted for a regional grass-fed beef cooperative trying to solve a specific problem. They needed a reliable source capable of supplying 40,000 pounds of finished beef per year to specialty grocery contracts in Denver and Kansas City, sustained consistently, not just in favorable years. They had been looking for 18 months. Carla had evaluated 14 properties across Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota. She had not made an offer to any of them. She arrived in early September 2017 with a forage sampling kit and 2 full days to spend. She walked the native prairie sections, cut samples at systematically spaced points across the paddocks, and reviewed the ledger's rotation records with Dale in the evenings. She asked about the 1988 drought and the 2012 dry summer. She asked what the forage height had been on August 14th, in the middle of the worst drought in 29 years, and Dale showed her the ledger entry. South paddock, big blue stem 8 inches, side oats grama 5.5 inches, soil firm but not cracking. She wrote something in her own notebook and did not say anything for a while. On September 19th, 2017, she sat at Myrtle's kitchen table under the hanging lamp that Garland had wired from the ceiling in 1978, and she opened her forage analysis folder, and she read the number aloud. The native prairie sections of the Hawk Farm were producing an average of 4,800 pounds of dry matter forage per acre per year. She set the folder down. Rack, the old healer, had been lying under the table, and he lifted his head briefly and then put it back down on his paws. The County Cooperative Extension benchmark for improved fescue pasture in Pawnee County, under conventional management in a normal rainfall year, was 2,400 pounds of dry matter forage per acre in a drought year. In the driest summer Pawnee County had recorded since 1988, the native sections of the Hawk Farm had produced twice the forage per acre of the county's conventional benchmark, not in a favorable year with good rainfall and a strong market. In the year when the pivots had run without stopping and the aquifer had dropped 11 feet, and the soybean fields next door had started yellowing in August. 4,800 pounds. The number sat in the kitchen for a long time. Myrtle looked at it the way she looked at the grass in the morning, without expression, reading what was there without adding anything to it. Dale, sitting to her left, turned the ledger to August's entry. From the drought summer of 1955, the entry he had already read dozens of times. His grandfather had written one line in pencil, faded but still legible. The rested ground held. Carla Weiss looked at the ledger and said, "How long has this been going on?" Myrtle said, "Since before I was born." Carla Weiss was quiet for another moment. Then she said she had a contract to discuss if Myrtle was interested. She said the cooperative could offer $4.20 per pound, live weight, for grass-fed cattle, meeting their marbling and finish weight specifications, guaranteed for 3 years with a renewal option. At the Hawk Farm's current stocking rate and demonstrated forage production level, the 700 acres could sustain a herd that would generate between $280,000 and $310,000 per year in gross cattle revenue. Dale had been tracking operating costs in the ledger for 11 years. They ran consistently at 38% of gross. The net was not a number that Chet Voss or Stacy Erb or Travis Dahl had ever calculated, because none of them had thought to ask what the ground was actually producing. They had looked at the comparable sales and the stocking rates and the organic matter deficits and the forage benchmarks, and they had measured the right things for a conventional model. And the conventional model had no column for what 66 years of patient rotation had built in the soil. Travis Dahl attended the field day Myrtle hosted the following May, along with 11 neighboring producers who had heard about the drought performance from the county extension office and from each other at the Pawnee City sale barn. He drove his own vehicle, not the company SUV, and spent the morning walking paddocks with Dale, asking questions rather than consulting screens. He asked about rest periods, about the signals that triggered a rotation adjustment in a dry year, about the ledger. At the end of the day, he asked Myrtle if she would consult on a rotation transition program for 2 of the Iowa operations pivot fields that had been taken out of corn due to declining yield response. Myrtle said she was 81 years old and Dale had been managing this rotation for 12 years and had made adjustments August had never thought to make and had been right about them. She said if Travis Dahl had questions, Dale could answer them at a rate she would set. Dale worked with Travis Dahl on those two fields for 2 growing seasons. The rate Myrtle set was $85 per hour, which Travis Dahl's management approved without negotiation, because the drought year had been expensive and they understood now what they had been missing. Dale recorded the revenue in the ledger under a new column he labeled consulting. The envelope Dale had written in October of 2017 proposed a partnership, his labor and management paired with Myrtle's land and knowledge, structured as a long-term operating agreement with a clear pathway to equity that did not require either of them to sell or dissolve what they had built. He had written it in longhand and sealed it and driven it to her house and left it in the mailbox because he thought a thing like that deserved to arrive like a letter rather than be handed across a table. Myrtle read it twice and called her attorney in Tecumseh, a woman named Dee Hansen who had handled the Hawk estate after Garland died and had practiced agricultural law in Pawnee County for 23 years. Dee Hansen read the proposal and said it was the most reasonable thing she had seen cross her desk in a long time. The agreement they signed in March of 2018 gave Dale a 30% revenue share on all farm operations, stepping up to 50% after 10 years of the agreement remaining in force, and a right of first refusal on the full operation at a negotiated valuation when Myrtle's estate settled. The 700 acres was not being sold. It was being shared on a timeline that reflected how long it took to truly learn a piece of ground. The agreement also included, in a clause Myrtle had drafted herself and handed to Dee Hansen on a notepad, an obligation that carried no monetary compensation. Dale was required to teach the rotation system to any producer who asked, free of charge, and to make the ledger available for study on the farm, and to maintain it in the same columns and format, without condensing or converting the records to a digital system for as long as the agreement remained in force. Dee Hansen looked at the notepad and said that was unusual. Myrtle said her father had put the records in a notebook because he wanted someone to read them 60 years later without needing a program to open them. She was keeping them the same way for the same reason. 4 ranchers from Otoe and Johnson counties came to the farm in the first year of the agreement, having heard about the cooperative contract and the drought performance from the extension officer's report and from conversation at sale barns and grain elevators across the region. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee on a Saturday morning in April 2019, and Dale walked them through the paddock records from 1951 to the present, explaining what the rotation calendar was designed to accomplish, what signals he used to make adjustments, what the data from the drought summer showed about the connection between rest intervals and forage resilience. One of them, a woman named Ruth Geiger, who ran 63 head on a leased quarter section near Humboldt and who had been losing ground on her operating margin for 3 years, came back 3 more times. By her 3rd visit, she had her own notebook. She was recording the height of her grass in the same columns August had designed in 1951, asking the same kinds of questions Dale had asked Myrtle in 2008 and 2009. Why this rest interval, what this species tells you, what you do differently in a dry year. Dale answered the way Myrtle had answered him, directly, with mechanism, without shortening anything. What happened on 700 acres in Pawnee County, Nebraska, is not a mystery. It is arithmetic, patient arithmetic, run on a ledger that nobody thought to appraise by people who had no interest in being appraised. Chet Voss saw the old fence lines and the ancient stock tanks and a stocking rate that looked low by conventional standards, and a widow in her 70s who would eventually come around. Stacy Erb saw native grass sections classified as a non-commercial forage asset with a productivity deficit relative to improved fescue under modern inputs. Travis Dahl saw a forage deficit operation running 30% below the benchmark for comparable latitude and soil type. Each of them was measuring real things with real instruments and arriving at real numbers. And each of them was wrong in the way that precise measurements of the wrong variables can be precisely wrong. What none of them measured was the direction of the trend. The organic matter on the Hawk native sections had been 4.8% in the 1998 graduate student soil test. It was 5.4% in 2017. It had been moving upward for 66 years under the same management, at a rate too slow to notice in any single season, building at the pace that biological capital builds, by accumulation rather than purchase. The organic matter on the Iowa operations crop ground had been 2.7% in 2012 and 1.9% in 2017. It had been moving downward under intensive management, consuming the biological capital faster than it was being produced. These two trend lines were the real difference between the two farms, not the fence age, not the stocking rate, not the pivot infrastructure. The direction the soil was moving. The value that August Hoke had been building since 1951 had no column in any spreadsheet Chet Voss or Stacy Erb or Travis Dahl was trained to read, because the spreadsheet was designed to capture what the ground was doing this year, not what direction it was pointed over the next 20. A balance sheet that measures assets at today's value and ignores their trajectory is not a complete picture. It is a photograph. The Hawk Farm's true balance sheet was the ledger, and the ledger ran to 4 notebooks, and nobody had asked to read it until Carla Weiss sat down at the kitchen table in September 2017 and read the drought year forage numbers and understood immediately what she was looking at. One kind of knowledge looks at a piece of ground and asks what it can be made to produce under optimal management and modern inputs. It arrives with a tablet and a color-coded soil map and a projection at 180 bushels per acre under irrigation. And it is sincere, and it is well-trained, and it is measuring the right things for a particular time horizon. And the time horizon it is measuring is about 5 years. Another kind of knowledge walks the ground before breakfast and reads the grass the way a careful reader reads a page, looking not for what is there, but for what it means, what it is telling you about what is happening 9 feet below the surface, and what happened on this same ground in July of 1955, and this knowledge has been accumulating its data for 70 years across multiple droughts and early frosts and wet springs, and it does not arrive with a projection because it does not need one. It already knows what the drought year will look like. It has watched drought years before. It wrote them in a ledger. What is rigid breaks when the aquifer drops, and the organic matter trend turns against you, and the dry summer arrives in earnest. What is patient and observant and rooted in deep place-specific knowledge holds. It holds in the way that perennial root systems hold, by going deep before the dry season begins, by building reserves slowly enough that no single season's return justifies the investment, but no drought can erase it either. The fourth offer that came to the Hoke farm was not an offer to buy. It was an offer to learn, made by a man who had already spent 11 years at that kitchen table before he ever put it in an envelope. And what Myrtle Hoke offered in return was not 700 acres. It was access to the ledger, access to the morning walk, access to the knowledge of why the south paddock comes before the north one, and what it means when the side oats grandma comes back before the blue stem, and how to read the soil's moisture by the resistance under your boot heel in August. These things had a value. They simply had no column. Dale Pruitt still walks the south paddock before the north one. He does it because Myrtle showed him why. Because the south-facing slope dries first and the early warning signals of stress show there before they show anywhere else on the farm, and because reading those signals before they become problems is the only management that matters in a dry year. He does it with a notebook in his hand now. The fifth in the series, August, started in 1951. Rack died in the winter of 2020 at 15 years old, and the dog that works with Dale now is a younger heeler named Grip that Myrtle's grandniece brought out from Lincoln as a pup. And Grip has learned the rotation calendar the way Rack learned it, through repetition and consequence, walking the same paddocks in the same order until the pattern is in the muscle. The ledger is on the shelf above the kitchen table in chronological order, 4 notebooks and counting. Some wealth is not a number on a spreadsheet. It is a direction and a discipline and a length of time. It is what happens when someone pays attention to one piece of ground long enough to understand what it is telling them. It is what survives.